My father ignored me my whole life for my perfect brother, but when he asked me to move my wedding for a camping trip with him, I agreed and gave my place at the altar to the man who actually loved me as a daughter. I'm 28 years old. I work in digital marketing from home, and 3 months ago, I got married in a small ceremony in my backyard with the people who really matter to me. My father wasn't there. Well, technically he was invited, but he chose not to come, and that decision basically shattered any illusion I still had about our relationship. I guess I should start at the beginning, when all this was just an uncomfortable feeling in my stomach and not a crushing certainty. I grew up in a home that, from the outside, seemed pretty normal. My mom, Caroline, my dad, Frederick, my brother, Maxwell, who's 4 years older than me, and me. Maxwell was always the perfect son, the one who got straight A's, the captain of the soccer team, the one who went to all the math and science Olympiads. I was a good student too. I mean, I wasn't a disaster or anything, but I was never extraordinary at anything specific. And I think that was my mistake from the beginning. When Maxwell won a tournament or whatever, my dad would organize special dinners, invite the grandparents, make a whole show of it. When I got good grades or won something at school, Frederick would say something like, "Very good, honey," and keep watching TV. My mom noticed it. I know she noticed it, because sometimes she'd hug me extra tight after those moments and tell me she was proud of me. But she never confronted my dad about it, at least not that I knew of. Things got weird when I was like 15, almost 16, I think. Turns out my mom had had an affair. I don't know exactly how long it lasted or with whom. But my dad found out and everything exploded. There was screaming, door slamming, my mom crying in the kitchen at 3 a.m, all that horrible drama that makes you feel like the floor is opening up beneath your feet. They got divorced relatively quickly. And at that moment, I thought that maybe my dad and I would get closer. That he'd see I was there for him. But no. Maxwell was like 20, then. He was in college doing some impressive degree, I don't know what, and Frederick spent hours on the phone with him, talking about his problems, about how betrayed he felt, about everything. With me, he barely spoke. When I tried to ask him how he was, he'd give me 2-word answers and go to his room. My mom met Walter like a year after the divorce. Walter is a systems technician, a quiet guy who makes bad jokes and who from day one treated me as if I were his own daughter, which was weird at first, but then it felt good, honestly. They got married when I was 18 and about to go to college. Walter paid part of my tuition, helped me move, was present in all the ways my dad never was. Frederick, meanwhile, was still obsessed with Maxwell, who by then had already graduated with honors and gotten an amazing job in London, because, of course, it had to be London. It couldn't just be a normal job in a normal city. When I was 22, my mom was diagnosed with pancreatic metastasis, cancer. Everything happened so fast that I didn't even have time to process it. Well, one day she was complaining about stomach pain, and 6 months later, she was dead. 6 months. Can you believe it? Walter was devastated, completely broken. But even so, he made sure I was okay, that I had support, that I didn't feel alone. My dad came to the funeral, of course, and Maxwell flew in from London, and everyone acted like the perfect family for a day, but I knew it was all theater. After the funeral, Frederick hugged me and told me if I needed anything to call him, but when I called him 2 weeks later, just because I felt horrible and needed to talk to someone, he didn't answer. He called me back 3 days later saying he'd been busy with work. Maxwell didn't even try to keep in touch with me after returning to London. The next few years were weird. I kept living my life, got my marketing job, moved to my own apartment, and basically built a life where my dad and brother were like secondary characters who showed up at Christmas and birthdays. Walter became my real father figure, the one who called to see how I was, the one who helped me when my car broke down, the one who really cared. And then I met Bradley like 5 years ago, at one of those super boring work conferences where nobody wants to be. Bradley is a graphic designer, has the best sense of humor, and from the beginning he understood the whole weird dynamic of my family without me having to explain much. We became a couple after dating for 6 months, and honestly, it was the healthiest and easiest relationship I'd had in my life. When Bradley and I decided to get engaged, like 8 months ago, I was super excited. We wanted something small and intimate, nothing ostentatious, just our favorite people in the backyard of our house that we'd bought together 2 years ago. We planned everything for our 4-year dating anniversary, which was on a perfect Saturday in late spring. I invited Frederick, Obviously, because, well, he's my dad. And I also invited Maxwell, although I knew he'd probably say he couldn't come from London. My dad said yes immediately. That of course he'd be there. That he wouldn't miss it for anything in the world. I remember when I hung up the phone after telling him, I felt weird. Like something didn't fit. But I tried to ignore it. Everything was going well until like 6 weeks before the wedding. My dad called me on a Tuesday night, which was already weird because he normally didn't call without a specific reason. He started with that voice he used when he was about to ask me something uncomfortable. You know, that super casual tone that's too casual. He told me that Maxwell had organized a camping trip with some of his college friends for that same weekend, and that they hadn't done something like that in years, and that Frederick really wanted to go because lately he'd felt disconnected from Maxwell. And then he said it. Just like that. He asked me if I could consider moving the date of my wedding, maybe postpone it a couple of weeks or a month, so he could go camping with Maxwell and also be at my wedding. I stayed quiet for like 20 seconds. I couldn't process what I'd just heard. This man was asking me to move my wedding, which I'd planned for months, which was on my anniversary with Bradley, which had everything reserved, guests confirmed, food ordered, everything, because my brother who lives on another continent decided to organize a camping trip and didn't bother to check if there was anything important that weekend. I asked Frederick if he was serious, and he said yes, that he knew it was a lot to ask, but that Maxwell rarely organized these things, and that it would be important to him that his dad was there. Like, he literally used those words, important to him, as if my wedding wasn't important to me, as if I were just a minor inconvenience compared to Maxwell's needs. Bradley was there with me when this happened and saw my face change. When I hung up the phone, I just stared at the wall for I don't know how long. Bradley asked me what happened, and when I told him, he got angrier than me, which was validating but also made the whole situation feel more real. He told me I didn't have to move anything, that it was ridiculous to even consider it. But I was already in that mental place where you're so used to being walked over that you don't even know if you have the right to be angry. I spent like 2 days thinking about it, and something in me broke or settled. I'm not sure. I called my dad and told him, fine, I'll move the wedding 2 weeks later. He sounded so relieved I almost threw up. He started thanking me a bunch, saying he knew I'd understand, that I was a good daughter, all that garbage. And then, before he could hang up, I said, oh, by the way, since you're going to miss walking me down the aisle on the original date, I asked Walter to do it on the new date. He went quiet. He said something, like, what? And I repeated it, very calmly, that Walter was going to walk me down the aisle. He asked me why I would do that, and I told him the truth, that Walter had been more of a father to me in the last 10 years than he had in my entire life, and that since he had chosen a camping trip over my original wedding, it seemed appropriate that someone who really cared about me had that honor. There was silence on the other end. Frederick tried to say something. I think it was a protest or an apology, but I'd already hung up. I felt weird, like guilty but also powerful. You know what I mean? Bradley hugged me and told me I did the right thing, but I wasn't sure of anything in that moment. Reorganizing everything was a logistical nightmare. Calls, emails, explanations to people who had already requested days off work. Some guests couldn't come on the new date, which sucked, but the ones who really mattered adjusted their plans. Walter almost cried when I formally asked him to walk me down the aisle. He told me it would be the greatest honor of his life, and I knew in that moment that I'd made the right decision, no matter how my dad felt about it. The new date came faster than I expected. It was a perfect Saturday. The sky was clear, we decorated the backyard with string lights and flowers, and everything looked beautiful. Simple, but beautiful. I had like 40 people there. Close friends, Bradley's family, Walter, some of my cousins, people who really knew and loved me. My dad wasn't there. Maxwell wasn't either, obviously, because he was on his stupid camping trip. When it came time to walk toward Bradley, Walter offered me his arm, and I saw his eyes were glassy. We walked slowly, and I tried not to think about how my dad had chosen to be in the forest with my brother instead of here with me. But it was impossible not to think about it. Honestly, the ceremony was perfect. Short, emotional, personal. Bradley cried when he said his vows, which made me cry, and everyone laughed at the right moments and applauded, and it was everything I wanted. Afterwards, during the reception, someone took a photo of Walter and me dancing, and he looked so proud, and I looked really happy. One of my friends sent it to me like an hour later, and something impulsive in me made me open WhatsApp and send the photo to Frederick. I didn't write anything, just the photo. My phone started ringing 10 minutes later. It was Frederick. I didn't answer. He called again, and again, and again. Bradley asked me if I wanted him to answer and tell him to leave me alone, but I said no, to let it ring. Finally, like an hour later, I answered. Frederick sounded like he'd been running or crying or both. He told me he was coming back, that he'd left the camping trip, that he'd be at my house in 3 hours, that please don't do anything, that we needed to talk. I told him there was nothing left to do, that the wedding had already happened, and I hung up. Bradley asked me if I was okay, and honestly, I didn't know the answer. Frederick showed up like at 10 at night, when most of the guests had already left and we were cleaning up with some close friends. He looked horrible, like he hadn't combed his hair and had that face of not having slept. He asked me to talk in private and I said no, that whatever he had to say to me, he could say there. He started with apologies, saying he'd made a terrible mistake, that he didn't know what he was thinking, that please consider doing a small second ceremony so he could be present, that this was important to him. And something in me just broke. I told him no, that there wasn't going to be a second ceremony, that I wasn't going to repeat one of the most important days of my life just to accommodate his guilt. And then everything came out, like 28 years of accumulated resentment. I told him that all my life he'd chosen Maxwell over me, that he'd never really been present for me, that when Mom died he wasn't there for me, but he was for Maxwell, that Walter had been more of a father to me in 10 years than he had in my entire life, and that I was tired of being the backup daughter who only mattered when it was convenient. I told him that he'd asked me to move my wedding for a camping trip, a stupid camping trip that wasn't even an important event, just because Maxwell organized it. And that showed me exactly where his priorities were. Frederick started crying. I'd never seen him cry in my life, not even at Mom's funeral. He tried to say something that he hadn't realized, that he didn't know I felt this way. All the typical garbage people say when you finally confront them. I told him I didn't care, that it was too late to realize things, that I'd already built a life without him at the center of it, and I was fine that way. He asked me to please forgive him, to give him another chance, and I told him that maybe someday. But that day wasn't today, and probably wouldn't be soon. I asked him to leave my house. He left. But the next day the messages started. Super long texts, apologizing, explaining that he'd been a terrible father, that he understood why I was angry, that he wanted to fix it. Every day, messages. I didn't respond. Bradley asked me if I wanted to block his number, and I considered doing it, but something stopped me. I don't know if it was hope or just morbid curiosity to see how far he'd go. Some of the messages mentioned that Maxwell had told him I was being dramatic, that I should get over it, which only made me angrier. Of course, Maxwell thought that. He'd never had to compete for Frederick's attention. He'd never been the automatic second place. Bradley and I were going on our honeymoon 2 weeks after the wedding, a trip to Greece we'd planned for months. The day before we left, I called Frederick. I told him I needed him to stop sending me messages for a while, that I was going on a trip and wanted to enjoy it without his constant guilt on my phone. He apologized. Again, and I told him I'd already heard his apologies, that I needed space, and that when I came back, maybe we could talk, but only if he respected my boundaries. He agreed. He sounded defeated, but he agreed. Greece was amazing, like exactly what we needed. Beautiful beaches, delicious food, nice hotels, and above all, peace. Zero family drama, zero guilt messages, just Bradley and me enjoying being married. Everything was going perfect, until, on our 5th day there, I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I don't answer random numbers, but something made me answer. It was Maxwell. Somehow he'd gotten a temporary phone or borrowed one from someone. I don't know. But there he was, calling me from London during my honeymoon. He started with that condescending tone he always uses, telling me we needed to talk about the situation with Dad. I asked him what situation, and he said I was being incredibly selfish and dramatic, that Frederick was devastated, that it had just been a mistake and I was punishing him disproportionately. I told him it wasn't my problem that Frederick was devastated, that he'd made his choices and I was making mine. Maxwell told me that family was more important than pride, that I was being immature, that I needed to grow up and forgive. I asked him where all that wisdom about family was when he organized his camping trip on the same day as my original wedding, without consulting me, and he went quiet for a second before saying, that was different, that he didn't know it was that important to me. I told him it was my wedding, that obviously it was important, and that if he really cared about family, he would have checked the calendar before planning his stupid trip. The conversation got ugly after that. Maxwell told me I'd always been resentful, that Dad had done the best he could, that I needed therapy to get over my victim complex. I told him that maybe he needed therapy to understand that being the favorite didn't make him less emotionally screwed up, that living in London and having a fancy job didn't mean he was better than me, and that his inability to have basic empathy was probably the reason I'd never seen him in a serious relationship. That really pissed him off. He yelled something about respecting my older brother, but I'd already hung up. Bradley, who had heard everything because Maxwell was yelling so loud it could be heard on speaker, hugged me and told me he was sorry, that I didn't deserve this. I felt bad for letting the drama invade our honeymoon, but he assured me it wasn't my fault. I blocked the number Maxwell had called from, but I knew that if he wanted to contact me again, he'd find a way. The rest of the trip, I tried not to think about it, but it was hard. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I really was being dramatic, like Maxwell said, if I was exaggerating everything. Bradley reminded me every time he saw me being thoughtful that I had every right to be angry, that it wasn't selfish to set boundaries, that people who really love you respect when you say you need space. When we got back from Greece, there were like 20 more messages from Frederick. I didn't read them all, but the ones I did read were more of the same. Apologies, promises to change, pleas for me to give him a chance. There was also a message from Maxwell, from his normal number this time, telling me he'd talked to Frederick and that he was really sorry, that I should consider forgiving him. As if Maxwell's opinion mattered in this. I didn't respond to any of the messages immediately. Instead, I talked to Bradley about what I wanted to do. I talked to Walter, who gave me the perspective of someone who'd seen this whole dynamic from the outside, and I tried to sort out my own feelings. After like a week of being back, I decided I needed to talk to Frederick face to face, but on my terms. I called him and told him I could come to his house to talk, but that I needed Maxwell, not to be there, that this was between the two of us. He agreed immediately. I went on a Saturday afternoon. His house was exactly as I remembered it, that same old couch, photos of Maxwell everywhere in his graduation and achievement stages, a photo of me from middle school hidden on a back shelf. That hurt more than I expected. We sat in the living room, and there was an uncomfortable silence before he started talking. He told me everything I expected him to say, that he regretted it, that he hadn't realized how badly he'd treated me, that he wanted to fix our relationship, that he loved me. I asked him directly if he really loved me, or if he just felt guilty, because finally, someone had told him the truth about his favoritism. He stayed quiet for a long time. Finally, he admitted that Maxwell had always been easier for him, that he saw a lot of himself in Maxwell, and that with me, he'd never known how to connect, especially after the divorce. I asked him if he'd ever really tried to know me, know what I liked, what I did, how I felt. He said no, that he'd assumed I was fine because I never complained. I told him I didn't complain because I learned from a young age that complaining didn't do any good, that my needs were always going to be second place after Maxwell. I set my boundaries clearly. I told him I wasn't going to pretend everything was okay, that I wasn't going to have a close relationship with him just because he felt bad now. But I also told him I wasn't cutting him completely out of my life, that if he really wanted to change, we'd have to start from scratch, slowly, with realistic expectations. I told him that meant occasional calls, maybe seeing each other once a month, but nothing more for now. No obligatory family parties. No pretending for Maxwell or anyone else that we were a happy family. I told him that if at any point I felt he was going back to his old patterns, I would walk away without hesitation. Frederick accepted everything. He looked small, vulnerable, and part of me felt sorry for him, but the other part, the part that had spent 28 years being invisible to him, felt nothing. I asked him if he'd talked to Maxwell about his own role in all this, about how he'd also contributed to this dynamic by never questioning why he got all the attention. He told me he'd tried, but that Maxwell didn't see the problem, that he said I was exaggerating. It didn't surprise me. I told Frederick that until Maxwell also acknowledged his part, I had no interest in talking to him. Frederick tried to defend Maxwell, saying it was just his way of being, and I cut him off right there. I told him that was exactly the problem, that he always had excuses for Maxwell, but had never had empathy for me. Before leaving, I told him one last thing. I told him that Walter had given me something he never gave me. The feeling that I mattered, that my achievements were worth something, that my presence was desired and not tolerated. I told him that Walter was going to continue being a central figure in my life, and that if that made him uncomfortable, it was his problem, not mine. He stayed quiet, but nodded. When I left that house, I felt strangely light, like I'd left something heavy there. It's been like 2 months since that conversation. Frederick calls me every 2 weeks or so. Short and somewhat forced conversations where he asks me how I am and tells me mundane things about his life. It's weird, awkward, but it's something. Maxwell sent me a message a few weeks ago, something brief about how we should all try to get along for Dad's sake, but I didn't respond. I don't owe Maxwell anything, and I definitely don't owe him pretending we're okay just to make him feel better about the family dynamic he helped create. Bradley and I are fine. Better than fine, actually. We're painting the guest room to turn it into an office. We adopted a cat named Merlot because he's the color of red wine. And basically, we're building this life that's ours, without the weight of toxic family expectations. Walter comes over for dinner every 2 weeks. He helped me install some shelves the other day, and honestly, it feels more like family than any forced dinner I've had with Frederick or Maxwell. Do I feel guilty sometimes? Yes. Honestly, there are moments when I think, maybe I was too harsh, that maybe I should have given more chances before blowing everything up, but then I remember the photo from my wedding, the one I sent to Frederick, where I'm dancing with Walter and we both look so genuinely happy, and I remember that I made the right decision. I'm not saying I'll never have a decent relationship with my dad. Maybe someday we'll get to something that resembles a friendship or something, but it's going to be on my terms, when I'm ready, and not because he feels guilty, or because Maxwell thinks I should get over it. Last week, Bradley asked me if I ever regretted how I handled everything. I told him no, that the thing I regretted was not setting boundaries much earlier, not telling Frederick years ago how I felt instead of letting it accumulate until it exploded. But I guess I needed to get to that breaking point to finally stand up for myself. You know what I mean? Sometimes I think things have to break completely before you can start rebuilding them the right way. Or maybe just accept that some things can't be rebuilt, and that's okay too. For now, I'm fine. I have a husband who loves me, a stepfather who really acts like a father, friends who support me, and a life I built despite all this family drama, not because of it. Frederick is there, on the periphery, trying, and that's something, I guess. Maxwell can stay in London with his inflated ego and his lack of empathy. I don't need him in my life to be happy. And me, well, I'm learning that it's okay to prioritize my own peace of mind over making other people comfortable with their mistakes. I'm still working on that, honestly. But I think I'm on the right track.